Welcome. We're starting just a minute or two early in case of rain. We want to get it all in. My name is Carrie Bates, and I work for the town and people of Ipswich as the director of Ipswich Recreation and Culture. And it is a pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's Lyceum Thursday. I just want to acknowledge Gordon Harris, who curated this summer series and has done such a faithful job week by week, setting up the chairs and the equipment and really doing a great job of inviting an eclectic collection of characters to speak to us on a wide variety of topics. I can assure you that in each week, the rigorous social discourse that follows the conversation has been very edifying. So this evening, we have a guest to introduce our guest, and he's a treasure. Our own roving reporter, John Muldoon from the local news. And as he steps to the stage, I just want to give him a shout out because we're so lucky to have a real newspaper in this town.
Thank you, Carrie. I've been instructed to keep my remarks short. I'll just say two things. When Bob's columns come in via email every week, they're one of the highlights of my week. I don't have to edit them, I just read them. They're always very well written. The second thing is, he told me that he was out and about today and he went into Betsy Frost, and he was recognised based on his caricature in the paper. So if you don't know what he looks like, you'll know in a second. The other thing is, our cartoonist is in the audience. So his picture isn't in the paper, but maybe there'd be a prize for guessing who he is. So without further ado, Bob Waite. Woohoo!
Thank you, John. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to put my water down. I keep thinking there should be a tarp they can pull out, like Fenway Park, but I guess that doesn't quite work here. So I will try to be brief, but I do want to say a few things at the outset. One is I do want to thank Gordon and Carrie for reaching out to me. They did so in March. It's amazing what you agree to do when it's far away. So in March, they said, would you do this in August? And I figured, in today's world, there may not even be an August. Why would I not say yes? So then, of course, immediately, Gordon wants a title for this non-existent speech or talk. And I did what anyone would do, I suppose, in the circumstances, and that is come up with the broadest possible topic that I could wrap anything into. Hence, you can take the boy out of Ipswich, but you can't take Ipswich out of the boy. However, these titles do become a bit confining, so I am going to talk mostly about Ipswich and from a personal perspective. And for some of you, I see many friends, even neighborhood friends from the South Green. Some of these things will seem familiar. Some of them you may want to correct my memory. That's okay. And everyone else, just enjoy. First slide, please. So I'm going to start. We all have a story about Ipswich and how we got here. In fact, I've heard a couple of them today. Just in the last few minutes before this started. Those are my parents, Nancy and Robert Waite. They met during World War II. My mother was from St. Louis, Missouri, of all places. My dad was from central Massachusetts. They met in the Army during the war. My mother outranked my father, which was interesting dynamic. She was a lieutenant and a nurse and a university graduate. My dad was a sergeant, was a technical sergeant working in the medical field, but he hadn't finished university at Notre Dame, where he went for his undergraduate, so he did not get to the lofty level. On the right, that's Tufts Dental School. Around the time my dad was there, those are all students. Don't you feel sorry for the people in those chairs? And they're so pushed together. So they didn't have, that was their original dental building. I don't want to go on this too long, but original dental building. It was after the war, and everybody came back on the GI Bill. So my dad was on the GI Bill. My dad was graduating. He actually graduated on the day I was born, so I really messed that up. He had just previously asked a dental equipment salesman if he had any suggestions about where he could open a practice. And my father, the dental equipment salesman said, "Well, what would you like?" My dad said, "I always wanted to live on the ocean in a small town, and I love boating and the outdoors." So next slide. So my dad didn't have a car, so the dental salesman, equipment salesman, really smart dental equipment salesman when you think about this, drove my dad, said, "I know just the place. It's a small town, around 6,000 people. The dentist, the main dentist in town, Dr. Wilder, is retiring, and I just think this is the place you would like." So he took my dad to the beach. He took him down to the boat launch area and around town, and that's how we ended up here. And again, thinking about that dental salesman, he sold probably way too much equipment to my dad for the next 30 years. So this salesman was pretty smart. On to the next one. So this is Manning Street. I don't know if you all know Manning Street. That was our house. This is post-war. My parents had very little money. People had very little money, and there was very little housing available after the war. So we lived at 12 Manning Street, but we shared the house with another family, and we continued to do that for several years. My world was bounded by the fire station at the end of the street, not allowed to go any further than that, and by High Street, so I could go up and down the street. But that was basically it. Ipswich back then was a different town in a lot of ways. One true of so many towns is people left their doors open and kids could kind of run free. But the other thing was, next door to us, the people, and I can't recall their names, had chickens and a chicken coop in what today you would think of as downtown Ipswich. Ipswich didn't have a lot of zoning back then. So if you went over into this neighborhood, you would also find chickens and even pigs sometimes. At any rate, my first and only corporal punishment came because I visited the chicken coop, and apparently the chickens didn't lay eggs for about a week after I tormented them. Next slide, please. It was a safe street. I mean, people used to think that the fire trucks would come racing up and down the street. In my recollection, I don't think they ever did. I think maybe making that turn from Central Street onto Manning probably was more than they could handle. That is me. The attire's kind of typical of the era. I was going to mention who lived in the house with us, if I can find that here. It's Dr. Frank Collins. So we were well served for dentists and doctors in the house for a time. And then after he and his family moved out, a fellow by the name of Fred Tompkins, who ran the Woolworth store, shared the house with us. So next slide, please. Yeah, well, these were the 50s. That's me on the left, looking like an only child, but that didn't last. I was the oldest. But soon we had, my parents had 4 children. We ended up ultimately having 6. Next slide. My first school was St. Stanislaus. My parents, I think, wanted me to get an early start. They may have thought that I needed an early start. So I went to St. Stanislaus was the parochial school, and they had a kindergarten. And in those days, there was no public kindergarten. And there was no Dickory Dock School, which came slightly later, where my sisters went. The thing I remember about St. Stanislaus is the teacher was really nice. Her name was Sister Jean. I think most of us had good memories of Sister Jean. But there was a Mother Superior who was a fearsome woman. She could have played linebacker for the New York Giants. And she told us that in this closet, which never was open, but in this closet there was a spanking machine. And so that's why you see this little character here. So we were really good. I was much better at parochial school than I was in public school. Some of you may remember me at public school, and you would probably agree with that. So I don't think spanking machines, I don't think they'd be welcome today as a concept, but back in the 50s, yes, there was a fearsome Mother Superior who said she had a spanking machine. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is what it was like. So politically incorrect. We were all, I don't have a picture of me in a Davy Crockett cap, but I can assure you I had one. I think this came after watching Rex Trailer, if you remember Rex Trailer on TV. I also played baseball, I guess like most everybody, most boys back in those days. This is me as a Baron in the minor leagues, where I actually was okay. The car and the station wagon, the black and white one, is from Ben Collins' Ford Motor dealership. So that another indication our family was growing. We were in a station wagon, which have all but disappeared. You see them in museums. I went on to major leagues, in Little League, to the White Sox, where I was terrible. And I remember there's one pitcher a couple years older than me, Wesley Winters, who I was convinced was going to kill me. So that seemed to affect my swing. Next slide. So my dad's practice, which started, by the way, in the Strand Theatre. Not many dental practices can say they started in a movie theater, but he rented an office on the second floor behind the balcony. And I remember going to that office. In fact, I remember seeing my first film at the Strand Theatre, because so he had so few patients at first, he's building his practice, and they used to have matinees that he would walk down into the balcony and watch films. And one time, for some reason, I was there and I watched that. His practice grew. He became reasonably successful. So we moved to the south side. Now, this is a different south side than you see today. For example, you can see the South Parish Hall photograph on the left, which sadly burned down, I think in 1979, something like that. Photo on the right, we have a number of people in the audience who would recognize the building and may or may not remember the incident, but that's Hurricane Carol in 1954, and we lost certainly scores, I don't know about hundreds, scores of trees, including some magnificent elm trees. So that house was known at the time, Dr. Grimes's house was known as the Columns. And the South Side store is just beyond there. Um, Sadly, we also lost the rest of the elms, of course, because of Dutch elm disease. So we moved to the south side. Next slide. Yeah, can you spot the imposter? So I'll say something about that in a second. But the house on the right, which my dad really wanted to have fit into the south green, he designed himself with a central, kind of a signature central chimney and quasi garrison look to it. So that was actually built in 1956, not in 1656. The only reason I say, can you spot the imposter? Many of us know that the house on the left wasn't there. It was in a whole different part. It was actually right over here. And also, when I was growing up, they kept changing the date on the sign as to which year it was built. And it kept getting later and later. I think it's finally stopped at 1654 or something like that. But it had started earlier, and then I think science took over and they adjusted the dates. Next slide. Yeah, so our life kind of, when you're a little kid, revolved between two stores. One is Bill's Variety Store, which was tucked into Choate Bridge. So that's Choate Bridge you see on the right in the photograph. And I think that's Bill, although I can't be sure. The great thing about Bill's was that he had models. I mean, he had the usual candies and things and ice cream, that's right. But he also had different types of models, ships and planes, the balsa wood gliders, all of that good stuff. Tiny little store. It was amazing. You could pack stuff in. So the other store, the South Side store on the right, was really, though, the focus of our culinary desires, which were candy and tonic. For those who are not from here, you might call that soda pop or Coke or whatever. Dinah Player ran the place when I was very young, and then a fellow from the UK named Harold Greeno ran it after that, and then it became, I think, a chiropractor's office. Just going to grab some water. So we spent our time, certainly in the summer, all but the winter, I guess, actually out on the green. That little sliver that you see in the middle, we used to play football. The traffic wasn't as bad, and the state hadn't expanded the road and narrowed it. And then on the green in front of our house, we played baseball and broke any number of windows in my parents' barn. They had a barn. Next slide. Shatswell School. So that's where I started out. One of my classmates actually sent me this book that we did all have, which I don't have anymore. But Peter Messler, who I've heard his name tonight, is in one of the pictures. I'm second from the top. Shatswell seemed huge to us at the time. Of course, it's now a retirement home. I wonder if some of my classmates aren't in one of the condos. But it seemed, the biggest place in the world. In the summer, there was a summer school there. I just wrote about this. We used to make crafts. And one of the things, we got this stuff, which kind of had strands in it. And we were instructed to make ashtrays for our parents. turned out the stuff, and they use the same stuff in Canada, I just found out, was asbestos. And we were making ashtrays out of asbestos for our parents. So Freud would just have a field day with what was really going on. We're not only inviting them to smoke or continue to smoke, but we're providing them with asbestos as well. Surprised there haven't been any lawsuits over that. Next slide. Yeah, this is just more of the classmates. That's kind of, Ipswich was I don't want to say it was a classless town in the sense that there was no sense of some people. There was a sense those people somewhere on Argilla Road had money, but beyond that, it was a pretty homogeneous town that didn't pay a lot of attention to things like that. I mean, one of my best friends at the time, Charlie Hazen, lived right on the river in a converted clam shack, and I thought I would have traded houses in a nanosecond, and on and on. I mean, people were well integrated with each other. Having said that, it wasn't the most diverse town in the world. Our thought about diversity was, there's some Polish people, some Greeks. Our neighborhood was sort of Irish, English, and then there's some Italians and French. But it wasn't very diverse beyond that. There was, again, back on Manning Street, there was one Jewish person I was aware of who actually had a cart pulled by a horse, and he collected stuff and made his money that way. The only African American I remember wasn't introduced to me as an African American was a woman on Green Street who was said to be an Indian princess. I only learned from people like Gordon Harris that she was actually equally African American. Anyway, in those days, everything seemed pretty good, other than the drills where we had to duck under our desks because we were going to be annihilated by nuclear bombs. But other than that, things seemed pretty good. Next slide. Yeah, I mean, just to get back to, why did my parents come here, and why do all of us enjoy being here? We did take full advantage of the beach, including probably illegal now, doing our own clam bakes on the beach, camping on Plum Island. We had a boat. Those of you who have a sharp eye will see that that's Lake Winnipesaukee and not Ipswich Bay, but that was a rare occasion. It just happened to be a good picture. But yeah, so I mean, our lives revolved very much around that. The other great thing for me was nobody seemed to care. They cared when you would drive a car, but in terms of driving a boat, I started at about 12, and you could go out. You'd need a license. I didn't kill anybody, but it probably was a bad idea. Next slide. Yeah, so we grew up next to a cemetery. My brother, Matt, sent me this picture on the right. By the way, we love the cemetery. It was like an extra playground with all, I'm sure it shows a lack of respect on our part, but it was just a comfortable place to be. I think, so that's the family that owned that house, the Gables, was the Wade family back in the day. They had 8 kids. Remember I talked about the population explosion? We had 6, 8. Grimes is what, 5? McSweeney's, they're all here. Lots of kids to play around with. The Wades, again, because there were 10 of them, needed a house like that. I think what happened here is we had a big picture window looking out towards the river behind us, and I think this poor bird met its demise by thinking it was flying somewhere else. So I didn't really have goth years. Next slide. Yes, well, then things progressed. I think, again, knowing this audience, some of you probably have your own fond memories. I think most people today think of Stonehenge, but it was the King's Rook prior to that. The great thing about it was they could never, at least during my years, they could never get a liquor license, which probably made things difficult for them. But it meant that when I was 15 or 16, I could go see some great groups. They were too close to a church. Again, it's ironic. Ipswich, when I was a reporter here, we proudly would report that Ipswich had more liquor licenses per capita than any other town in Massachusetts, and that was certainly true in the 70s. But this place couldn't get one because they were too close to, it might have been the Christian side, one of the churches was too close. Anyway, you can see, I don't want to take you too far down musical memory lane, but you can see some of the groups that were here. I mean, I particularly remember Bonnie Raitt, who's still going strong. Next slide. Yeah, I don't want to say it. So my parents were always trying to improve me. So there used to be dancing lessons at the South Parish Hall on the South Green. And probably the less said about that, the better. I wasn't very good. I still needed lessons for my wedding, so it never really took. On the right is Boone Hall, and it's festooned out there differently than what I'm going to mention. And that is, we had the teen club dances there. And those were, again, my dancing skills put me on the sidelines most of the time. But those were a lot of fun, and people like Joe Carpenter helped organize that. And it kind of worked. I mean, if the idea was to get us off the street or away from Quince Corner, at least one night a week, it did work. Next slide. Yeah, first job. So I wrote a piece about my time at the Margery restaurant, which was once one of the great restaurants, one of the highest ranked restaurants in America, according to Holiday magazine, as I recall. Was run by a total madman. If any of his relatives are here, I probably shouldn't mention his name, but he was a madman. I worked as a busboy, which is kind of, so I started as a dishwasher, which is the lowest level, but busboy's not a big uplift. And I guess one of the more interesting things when I think I was 16, was that the head busboy, who was this really good-looking guy in his early 20s, and the head waitress, who was a very good-looking woman in her late 20s, I would guess, every night as we were closing up, so I always stuck around for this, would head to his car, and the car would bounce around a lot. I thought, well, that's interesting. And then, just before her husband's car arrived, they would jump out and rearrange themselves. And I just thought, wow, being an adult's going to be fun, as long as you don't get caught. I also worked at what back then was called Goodale's Apple Orchard. That was another eye-opener of a job, a lot of work. It's run by the McLeod family back then, not the Russell family. And did they take advantage of the fact that there's no, as did the Margery, that there's no minimum wage in agricultural or restaurant jobs. So we got paid pretty much nothing to move apples around. Next slide. Trying to stay ahead of the rain here. So I work, again, I have to be careful because there are people I worked with. Worked at at the beach and up on Castle Hill in something called the crew. So the crew, this will be a thumbnail quick sketch. Our job each day was to clean the beach. Crane Beach was, I think, correctly seen as one of the cleanest beaches on the East Coast. We did a pretty good job. They used to have barrels that said "please" on them. I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember that. We did that first thing. Then we parked cars. And then if you were lucky and could drive a tractor, you got sent up to Castle Hill to mow the allays that go down to Steep Hill. So I fortunately had learned on a standard, so I was one of the people that got to do that. My other assignment was in the bathhouse, the men's bathhouse, not the women's bathhouse. And the good news about that was it was busy for a little while, and then I could read. And so most of my summer reading got done there. Next slide. Yeah, well, then my life changed. I worked in a political campaign for a man by the name of Michael Harrington. This was a special election. Bill Bates, a longtime congressman, a Republican, had died. I mean, his father had been the congressman. I mean, it had been the Bates family. It's almost like a family heirloom. Special election. The big issue in 1969, when it took place, was the Vietnam War. I wasn't a big fan of the Vietnam War, so I worked in that campaign. The fellow on the left, well, in the picture on the right, the fellow on the left, he's somewhat cut off, is Robert McPhail. So he headed up the Ipswich effort. The person who headed up the full effort was a guy named Bill Wasserman, and that's how I met Bill Wasserman. I had sort of a crew of, I was a youth coordinator, it was called. I'm not sure how coordinated we were, but I had a small group that I was deploying in different places. And Bill and I had a big argument. Actually, we had the big argument right there. There used to be a coffee shop right there, and there used to be North Shore Weeklies just to the right here. We were in the coffee shop, and I disagreed with him about where I should take my merry troop. And it got really heated, and people were turning around. And then suddenly he just said, "Fine." And then he said, "What are you doing next summer?" And I said, first I didn't know. First I thought he was really mad at me. And he said, "What are you doing next summer?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to work at the beach." And he said, "No, you're not. You're going to come work for me." I said, "Okay." I don't think this is a great start of a friendship, but okay. So that's how I met Bill, and then I came back from university. I was at the University of Wisconsin. Came back every summer as a summer reporter and summer editor, taking the place of the regulars when they went on holiday. Something, John Muldoon, you need to institute. Maybe I should come back and be your summer reporter. I've been telling John he needs to take a holiday, not to shame him with that publicly. But next slide. Well, for what it's worth, Harrington won the election. He beat Bill Saltonstall, Leverett Saltonstall's son. Yeah. So I had a column almost from the beginning. So Selma Williams, who's right here, would remember this photograph with my headband, probably already trying to hide the fact that I was going to eventually go bald. But yeah, so and then I sort of morphed into, I don't know, gave up the John Lennon glasses, and I don't know what those glasses are. Next slide. Yeah, my first assignment was with a guy named, an editor named Bill Castle was my first editor to Danvers Herald. And he got a call from Goodyear saying, the blimp's going to be at Beverly Airport. Would you would you like to send somebody to cover it? And Bill Castle, I'm sure, looked around his little newsroom and decided who was most expendable in case something bad happened to the blimp. So, Bob, this one's for you. So I did it. It was actually fun. The only nervous part about it, I don't know how many of you have been up in a blimp, is that after we get up, the pilot tells me that if the wind gets above 35 miles per hour, we come over right here in the blimp. We go over the South Green because they would take me wherever I wanted. So that's why I went, and out towards Castle Hill down Argilla Road. But as we're doing this, he says, the wind's about 20 miles per hour. And I said, yeah. He says, well, if the wind's over 30, I think it was 30 knots, it's like 35 miles an hour. He said, the engines aren't powerful enough and we'll just go out to sea and end up in Iceland. Then I realized why Bill Castle had put me on this assignment. So there was a PR guy for Goodyear that set all this up. And I was young and a bit of a wise ass. I wrote the story, but in the story, I called this guy, the PR guy, the blimp pimp. So Wasserman was unbelievably, I don't know whether it's forgiving or lenient or whatever. I mean, he put up with things like that. So the PR guy calls, right? I mean, he sees the story, and I'm thinking, this is it. This guy's, he didn't, I could have called him anything. All he cared about was getting coverage. So I now teach public relations to graduate students, and I use this example with them that for most PR people, they could care less what you call them as long as their product gets into the story. Next slide, please. Yeah. So I took a junior year in England at the University of Essex. It's a car I owned while I was there, which I bought for $1,800, brand new from the factory and company for $1,854. That's how strong the American dollar was. However, it's a Triumph Spitfire. Not the most reliable car in the world. I drove it with a girlfriend from England to Moscow and back, 31 days, about almost 8,000 kilometers, so about 5,000 miles. That's a picture in what today is Belarus. Those are the Pripyat marshes. This is in late March, early April. And I got stuck back there, and I wish I had the full picture. And these 4 Russian lorry drivers, truck drivers, came and picked up my car and carried it from that morass to where you see it there. Anyway, I wouldn't recommend this. It wasn't something I told my parents beforehand that I was going to do, but I did do this trip to Moscow. Next slide. Yeah, these are the happy people of Moscow during the Soviet days. See the security people on the left. You've got the not very fashion conscious Muscovites. When you went to the Soviet Union back then, there was something called in-tourist, and you had to, everything was controlled by them. You had no money. They gave you coupons for everything, including petrol, and you had to be they gave you a map that showed no side roads, just the main road, and you were not allowed to ever go off that road, although I did. And I got some pictures from that and got them out. And if you didn't show up at your hotel by 6 o'clock, they came after you. So it wasn't the most relaxing trip. It wasn't, spring break in Fort Lauderdale. Next slide. Yeah, or Daytona Beach. This is Dayton Beach. I meant Daytona. Yeah, that was one of the pictures I got off the main road. Life was pretty basic. Ended up spending time in Poland, and given Ipswich's large Polish population, I was actually able to stay with relatives of Ipswich families in Krakow and Warsaw, which was great. And I wrote my first travel story for the Chronicle on that trip. One of the things that was interesting in Krakow, they lived in the city. I mean, they were as downtown as we are, but they didn't have indoor plumbing, and it was cold. And I remember going in the middle of the night. Even back then, I guess I had to go in the middle of the night. It's not gotten any better. A walk outside and sitting on the seat, and it was so cold I wasn't sure I was going to be able to get up, and I might be stuck. You know the joke about the kid with the tongue on the metal. Well, this was sort of like that, only more disturbing. Next, please. Yeah, so then I came back from Poland and Pacific News Service. That's who I was working for. Bill Wasserman offered me a job editing a Sunday newspaper, North Shore Sunday, which people may or may not remember. After about 6 months, out of the blue, I got a call from Ed Brooke's office. Ed Brooke was a Republican senator from Massachusetts, first African American elected to the Senate, looking for a press secretary. Thinking back, the best I can guess is there was a representative from Hamilton named Tim Clark, and I think he may have, I've never fully figured out, but I think he was a Republican, he may have suggested my name. Anyway, to make a long story short, I went to work for Ed Brooke. It was his re-election year. He was running for a third term, and all hell broke loose. He had the brilliant idea. He's a wonderful man. He just passed away a few years ago, but he had the brilliant idea of divorcing his Italian American wife at this moment in a state that then was 61% Roman Catholic with a large Italian population. The divorce was acrimonious, with some interesting headlines. So, picture on the right is actually Ed Brooke giving his concession speech, and that's me, sort of up near the top there, with the mustache. You're probably saying, well, what are you thinking? Thinking, I don't have a job. It's exactly what I was, well, it probably isn't exactly what I was thinking. It's certainly what I was thinking the next morning. Next slide. So, I literally got back to Washington, D.C. the next day. I flew back from Boston to Washington. I was the only person in the office. And I sat out front because there was nobody there. And so this was on a Wednesday. And the phone rang, and person asked for me. And I said, who's calling? And the person said, Bob Dole. We had a guy in my office who would pretend to be all kinds of people, including Jimmy Carter. I mean, think back to, the time we're talking about, George McGovern.
George McGovern.
There you go. I thought it was that guy. So I actually said, thinking, this guy is pulling one on me. I just said, yeah, and I'm Jimmy Carter, and I hung up. Phone rings again. It's a true story. Pick it up. Is Bob Waite there? And I recognize it's the same voice. The more I think about it, this isn't really, it doesn't sound like my friend. So I changed my voice from my natural voice to another voice to say that I was Bob Waite. I don't know whether he bought it. Dole had a way sometimes of just letting strange things go, just. Anyway, long story short, Dole offered me the job, and I was going to turn it down. And Ed Brooke took me aside and said, you really should think about this. He said every time I needed a vote on civil rights, on veterans affairs, on trying to think, disabled, things like that, he said Bob Dole was always there. Because I just thought, well, he's just too conservative for me. And he is more conservative than I am, but that's how I ended up there. That is my office in the Bob Dole suite of offices. It's a bit, I think I pulled out a drawer just to make it look worse. A guy named Peter Landry, who worked for Bill Wasserman, happened to be down meeting with Jody Powell and Carter's people, and he decided to come by, that we knew each other, visit me, and he just thought this was hilarious, so he took a picture of it. Next slide. So after politics, I worked for a number of companies, so IBM, Ford Motor Company. I lived in places like New York and briefly in Dearborn, Michigan. With IBM, I ran something called External Affairs, so it was like a State Department, which I had no particular credentials to do, but it was a lot of fun. Next slide. I do want to. So when I went to Ford, they gave me, after 2 years running the Washington office, they gave me a choice between going to Detroit or to Toronto. I had never been to Toronto, but I had been to Detroit, so I picked Toronto. If people can follow that logic. We don't actually, that isn't how we live there on the right. It's actually was shot in Antarctica. My wife and I were there. But people my friends from Ipswich think that everyone in Canada kind of lives like that on the right. So that was quite a long time ago, 1986 is when I moved. I thought for 2 years, but then IBM came back and grabbed me to run communications for them in Canada. Next slide. Always came home. Not just because of this. There were some family things too, but so again, some of you, this may be beyond people's memories. We actually had 2 clam places in walking distance of the south side. One was Dusty's, which is, I think there's a park there, or it's close to where the YMCA is. But that was it wasn't very expensive. And then David Grimes or somebody could help me, but I think Russell Grant had clams at certain points. He certainly had lobster. And that was just at the top of Argilla Road. Next slide. So I came home for various reasons. That's the boys, my 2 brothers, my dad, and myself, Fenway Park. So I told you, my dad had an interesting way of getting away with things. When he was at dental school, I swear he spent half of his time at Fenway Park. He said he spent half of his time in the bleachers, not in these seats. So I was brought up in a tradition of going to Fenway Park, and still do. That's my 2 kids and my niece in front of my parents' house. That's back for Easter. Next slide. So now we end with a shameless plug. So I just published a book. The proceeds go to Ipswich local news. So You can either do it because you buy one because you enjoy my reading, or because you enjoy John Muldoon's newspaper, or both. But I would invite you, if you want to get it as a Kindle or through Amazon, you can do that. I have some copies here. I'd be happy to sign those. That's it. I think there's one more that says questions. There's Ed Colley's version of me. Yes?
Yeah, I was just curious if you had any encounters growing up with John Updike or any kind of influence from him, or any, being your passion with writing.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So my dad was good friends. Well, I don't know how good a friend a dentist is to someone. He was a good friend of John Updike's, and John would give my dad a signed copy of every one of his books, for example, which we still have. I wrote a column about this, but which I think is in the book. But my dad had John in the chair, and was doing whatever he was doing with the drill held high, no doubt. And I was working for a student newspaper at the boarding school I was at the time, Hebron Academy. And my dad asked if I could interview John Updike. I think I was 15 or 6, probably 15. And what are you going to say when somebody's got, first of all, your mouth is filled with cotton swabs, and there's this guy sort of standing over you with a diamond-tipped drill. So I'm not even sure he said yes. I think my dad heard some gurgling and said, fine, he'll be at your house on East Street at 10 o'clock on Saturday, which is, so in that sense, he not only was an influence, certainly somebody I read, even when I think some of his books I wasn't supposed to be reading, but he gave me an opportunity to do an interview that was important in terms of building a portfolio. Because of that, I later, again, maybe at 16, interviewed Wilma Rudolph, the Olympic champion, who was at Poland Spring at some sort of Great Society project. And then Nathan Pusey, who was the president of Harvard. And those, each one led to the other in the sense that, I already interviewed John Updike. I mean, what's the president of Harvard? So he was influential. So I also interviewed him a few years later about his trip to Africa, which was a really interesting conversation. Controversial. He talked about some things, including the way women were treated, that normally, if it hadn't been for Bill Wasserman, it wouldn't have been in a family community newspaper, but it was interesting stuff. And I never got direct feedback. I got feedback from Bill, who would simply say, John liked that when I did a column. I read most all of his books. I can't say that his style influenced me. I don't have the vocabulary, I don't have the genius, and I don't have the vocabulary. And I'm a short sprinter, as you'll see if you get the book. There's a certain editor who wants to keep them all to 650 to 700 words, which is fine. I'm a short form person, so I always admired Updike. But yeah, I think anybody who grew up in Ipswich couldn't not be influenced by him. There's also, I'll probably write a column later about this. I made light of this in the little addendum to, I think it's this week's column, where I talk about my next book being Tarbox Secrets Revealed. When that book came out, boy, everybody was talking about, who's that person? Anyway, that was a long answer, but I hope that was interesting. Yes?
I actually worked for your dad. Oh, thank you. I worked for your dad the summer of 1958
Oh.
before I married Bob McPhail. Whose picture you showed up there. And I just got to know your dad just for that one summer because Barbara was taking a course somewhere else and I just filled in before I got married. And I remember this man used to come in and he could seem to have an appointment whenever we had an opening. It didn't matter. And I thought, I wonder what he does. And it turned out to be John Updike. So.
Yeah, he wrote in the morning and then apparently did some really interesting things during the afternoon.
Anyway, I knew your whole family and
Oh.
it's wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
And I enjoy your column.
Well, thank you very much. So that would have been on Central Street?
Yes.
Yeah, so my dad's second office, so he had three, again, was on the second floor. I don't know if you remember those stairs. They
That
were,
was the second floor.
yeah, challenge. It was above what then was the Ipswich Electric Shop
Oh, right.
and close to, maybe strategically from my dad's point of view, Marcarell's package store. So
Yes.
it's just,
And
just-
also, my mother was secretary to the school committee when your dad was chairman of the school committee.
yeah.
So
Yeah,
we have these nice connections.
I'm amazed, I guess, because I feel, I don't know about inadequate, but I feel like I'm not doing enough. So many people back then had these full-time jobs, but also, I mean, I'm sure they do it today, but the amount of time the school committee took, my dad was significant. And everybody, you know, George Giannakakis and Nancy Thompson, I still remember his colleagues, yeah. It's just wonderful people give of themselves and volunteer, and it's nice to see they still do, even though they squabble sometimes during meetings, but I'm sure they did back then. Any other, I saw something somewhere back there.
Hi, Bob. Curious if you have any anecdotes or any good stories about Katie Robertson.
Well, I mean, Kitty, she was just a unique human being. She did not care what anybody thought in terms of what she wore. First of all, if anybody hasn't read the book, The Orchard, they should. It's one of the best, not just best Ipswich books, but just one of the best books. I mean, I tell people all the time to read that book. Which gives you a flavor of her grittiness. So she was of a generation of women reporters that some of whom I only met later in Washington, D.C. So Washington had its little cadre of women reporters. And there was another one, Midge Preston. But Kitty just had a way of getting to the nub of stories, wrote beautiful columns, so she was very influential. Her columns certainly influenced my writing, and she was very kind. Like, she had a lot of time for me. She was a mentor. I'm trying to think of something in particular. I mean, just when she would enter a space, people knew she was there. She would often wear, I guess, what, Sketcher-like, I don't know what they were called back then, espadrilles or some sort of, wasn't espadrilles, that's too fancy, some sort of sneaker. And she would often, and she would wear these kind of capri pants. Again, not as fancy as that sounds, but she would come into the office, and she clearly had just gotten off the boat, and so she, there was everything but seaweed kind of dripping off of her. I mean, one story I know from her daughter Betsy. she would go right up to the line, either in her radio broadcast. She did a radio broadcast every day after going to meetings at night. Then she would write columns, and she said something that crossed the line, at least in the eyes of this one individual. And it ended up in court. And as Betsy told it, they had no money. She was from a well-to-do family, the Crockett family, but she was at the end of the line. Family money had run out. And she was so they had to go to Massachusetts Superior Court for this lawsuit. And a Hamilton, I've forgotten his name. Who was the prominent Hamilton attorney? Harold Wilcox? Does that sound right? Yeah, I think it was Harold Wilcox was defending her. Anyway, so she lost the case. The other person won, and she thought this is it. But then the judge said, and I fine you $1, and that was the end of it. And the other person didn't appeal. But she was feisty. I mean, I guess that's the best word I can use. She made the rest of us braver. Anything else before the rains come? Well, thank you. I appreciate you being here. Again, if people are interested in the book, I'd be happy to sign it for you.